Welcome to The Explainer. So here's a wild idea. Can you use a mathematical equation to test whether a sacred text has divine origins? Today we're diving into a fascinating research manuscript that tries to do exactly that, applying a pretty serious statistical framework to the text of the Quran. And look, that's a pretty bold question, right? But this analysis isn't trying to prove or disprove faith. It's different. It's using the tools of probability to ask a very specific question. How well does the evidence inside the text support one explanation over another? All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll ask if this is even a question we can test. Then we'll look at the framework they use, dive into some of the actual evidence they present, see how the final numbers shake out, talk about the all-important limits of these kinds of models, and finally wrap up with the core idea they call the convergence argument. So, how do you even begin to tackle a question like that? Well, the paper we're looking at suggests bringing in a mathematical tool, one that's specifically built to weigh evidence between two competing ideas. And that tool is called the Bayes factor. Now, think of it like a statistical tug of war between two theories. If the score is exactly 1, it's a perfect stalemate. The evidence doesn't favor either side. But if the score is, say, 10, that means the evidence is pulling 10 times harder for one theory over the other. It's a way to let the data do the talking and tell you which explanation it finds more, well, likely. Okay, so what are the two teams in this tug of war? On one side, you have Hypothesis HD, the idea that the Quran is a divine revelation. And on the other side, you've got HH, the idea that it's a purely human-authored text from that specific time and place in history. The entire model is built to see which of these two stories makes more sense of the patterns found inside the book. Okay, so before we jump into the really fascinating evidence, we need to talk about the rules of the game. Because the researchers behind this are super careful about one major statistical trap: overcounting your clues. Yeah, to make sure their analysis is solid, they don't just count every single little thing they find. Instead, they group related patterns together into what they call evidence clusters. And this is a really, really important step. It's what stops you from accidentally counting the same clue 5 different times, which would, totally skew the results and make your case look way stronger than it actually is. All right, now for the fun part. The paper looks at a whole bunch of these evidence clusters, but let's just zoom in on a few really interesting examples to see how this whole thing works in practice. So the first cluster we're going to look at revolves around the 57th chapter, or surah, of the Quran. Its name is Al-Hadid, which literally means the iron. What's also interesting is that it sits right at the exact midpoint of the book's 114 chapters. Okay, this is where it gets pretty wild. The analysis uses something called the Abjad system. It's an ancient method where every Arabic letter has a numerical value. And if you look at the table, here's the claim. The letters that make up the Arabic word for iron, hadid, they add up to 26. And what's the atomic number of iron? It's 26. But wait, it gets deeper. The letters in the full chapter title, Al-Hadid, they add up to 57, which is the exact number of the chapter itself. This mashup of text, numerology, and modern science is what they present as a powerful evidence cluster. Now here's a totally different kind of clue they look at. This one's all about word counts. The analysis points out that the word for sea shows up 32 times, while the word for land appears 13 times. Okay, so what? Well, if you do the math and figure out the percentages, sea makes up about 71% of those mentions, and land makes up about 29%. And that, as the chart shows, is an almost perfect match for the actual ratio of water to land covering the surface of our planet. And it doesn't stop there. This slide shows another kind of evidence cluster they call semantic balance. The idea here is that words with opposite meanings are reported to show up the exact same number of times. It's pretty amazing. For instance, the words for good deeds and wrongdoings both reportedly appear 167 times. Life and death, 145 times each. It's this incredible symmetry built into the language. So the argument they're making is that these aren't just a bunch of random, lucky coincidences. They actually propose what they call a multi-code architecture. The idea is that different numbers are used almost like thematic watermarks throughout the text. So patterns around the number 7, for example, tend to be linked with themes of creation and completion. Patterns around the number 11 are connected to the Prophet Muhammad. And the number 19 is presented as a kind of mathematical signature that helps verify the text's overall structure. Okay, so you've got all these different clusters, the numbers, the word counts, the symmetries. What happens when you plug all of that into the Bayesian model? What do the final scores actually look like? Well, the analysis doesn't just give one simple answer. Instead, it gives results from two different models, which start with different assumptions. There's the cautious model, which is designed for a total skeptic. It really puts the brakes on any claims that might be a bit fuzzy, like how exactly you count certain words. Then there's the balanced model. It starts from the position that, hey, divine revelation is at least plausible, which reflects the source's own internal framework. And even with that super skeptical, cautious model, the final Bayes factor comes out to over 5 million to 1. Now let's remember what that means. According to this specific model, the evidence is 5.3 million times more likely if you assume divine authorship than if you assume purely human authorship. Okay, but what about the balanced model, the one that's less skeptical from the get-go? Well, here the number just explodes. The calculated Bayes factor skyrockets to 643 trillion to 1, all in favor of the divine authorship hypothesis. It's just a mind-bogglingly huge number. Now, obviously, those numbers are absolutely staggering, but, and this is a huge but, the paper itself is very careful to lay out some really important limitations and reality checks. This is not being presented as a slam dunk, case closed argument. And it is absolutely critical to get this. These numbers are not proof. The researchers themselves hammer this point home. A Bayes factor is always dependent on the model you build and the assumptions you make. It's not like taking a temperature. As you can see here, the rules for counting words have to be super strict. Some of the data actually comes from tradition and not just the raw text, and some of the scientific claims are stronger than others. In fact, in what I think is a pretty impressive display of intellectual honesty, the manuscript explicitly calls for a rigorous, independent audit of its own findings. It basically says, hey, the next step should be for someone else to use a public version of the text, publish all the rules beforehand, and pre-register every single claim before they even start looking. That's the gold standard in science to avoid cherry-picking the results you like. So we've seen the evidence, we've seen the jaw-dropping numbers, and we've talked about the crucial caveats. What's the big idea we're supposed to take away from all of this? The central argument isn't really about any single miracle or one killer fact. It's not just the iron thing or just the land and sea ratio. No, the real argument is about the convergence, the way that multiple, seemingly unrelated types of patterns all pile up together. You've got the numerical stuff, the literary symmetries, the scientific parallels, all pointing in the same direction, all in one single book. Look, in the end, this analysis doesn't give us a final, easy answer. What it does, though, is pretty fascinating. It uses the formal language of statistics to frame a very old question in a completely new way. It lives right at that crossroads of faith, data, and human interpretation. And it leaves us with a really profound question to chew on. At what point does a pile of coincidences get so big, so varied, and so strange that you have to start looking for a different kind of explanation?